I've been commenting on a debate that I went to last night called What Do You Believe? And the topic was, Does God Exist? And the debate was between Dr. John Mark Reynolds of the Houston Baptist University, the provost of Houston Baptist University, and Dan Barker, who is the president of Freedom from Religion Foundation, a former Christian preacher who left Christianity, embraced atheism, and now he debates and has a radio show and other things sort of representing an atheist perspective on things. And so they had a debate last night at the Houston Baptist University, and I went out to listen to the debate, and I'm just offering some various thoughts and reflections or presentations on what I experienced when I went to the debate, for whatever that may be worth. And I think what I'd like to do now, I've been talking a little bit about Reynolds and his presentation defending belief in God, and I've been trying to highlight perhaps some of the strengths of the content of his presentation, as well as some of, in my perception, the weaknesses of his presentation. And there were a number of weaknesses, as I see it, in his presentation. At the end of my last comments on this, I was focusing on his refusal to offer a definition of God, which I think when everything is said and done about this particular debate, that's probably what's going to be most remembered about it, is the fact that Reynolds was reluctant to offer a definition of God, and then when he finally does, he offers a deistic definition of God, because he's clearly trying to be as minimalistic as possible in his presentation. He doesn't want to have an elaborate definition of God that would require lots of defense of various parts of the definition. And so he was very reluctant to offer a definition of God and tried to defend that on logical grounds, that you can know what something is without offering a definition of it. And I think that there's something to that. I think that there's something that he's communicating that is meaningful, and that there is an argument to be made there. However, when you have a public discussion on an issue and a person is affirming the existence of God and the other person is denying the existence of God, I think it is incumbent on the person defending the existence of God to make it clear what they are trying to defend. Because if you don't make that clear, then what is being debated is unclear to the audience. And so if you're not going to offer a definition, I think the burden that you have to bear is to explain why it is you won't offer a definition. And do you think a definition is in you can't make one, or there is not one, or that any definition will do, because people have different understandings of things. And so I think that when all is said and done, that's probably the thing that will be most remembered about this particular discussion. Although that's unfortunate, because I think there were some other significant points that were made. Although in general, I would say that the Christian position was not as clear and as tight as it should have been, or could have been. The arguments that he offered for God's existence, for example, were arguments that didn't clearly explain how you get to God's existence from those observations, even if they are true. Like, for example, to say that morality cannot be justified on atheist grounds is not the same thing as showing that God exists. Now, it can be, I think it can be done, or a reasonable case can be made to say that morality presupposes a supreme moral standard or a supreme good. But those are all very tedious questions, and they require definitions, they require a clear understanding of terms, and they require a clear understanding of how you get from one point to the next. And as far as I can tell, the Christian representative here, the theist, was not particularly clear on how those arguments lead to the conclusion he wants to get to. And part of the problem there, of course, is how do you get to the conclusion when you don't even have a clear notion of what you mean by God? And so that was, I think, one of the great weaknesses of his position. But there were other things that I think were left unanswered at the end of the presentation. And at the end of the evening, as far as I could tell, there were several things that were not really satisfactorily answered. For example, the atheist brought up during the course of the night the question, where did God come from? Where did God come from? And he brought this up in the context of the argument from design. And he said that even if we allow the point that designers, or things that are designed, or things that exhibit characteristics of design, need a designer, the question still remains, why don't we need a designer of God? And the Christian, as far as I could tell through the evening, never touched the question. He never responded to the question, which is profoundly disappointing, because it's a very common question from atheists, and I think it's a very answerable question if we just think very clearly about what we're talking about. Another one that I did not see any serious effort to address was the problem of evil. And the theist, Reynolds, in the debate simply waved off the problem by saying that there are theists, there are people who have believed in God, who for whom the problem of evil was not an issue, because they had different understandings of the attributes of God or the nature of God, so that the problem never arises. And he mentioned specifically Plotinus, who understood everything to emanate from a single one or source of all reality, presumably understanding this to be somewhat equivalent to what we mean by God, a supreme first reality or principle, and everything else comes from God, and evil is simply the degrading or corrupting or passing out of being of that supreme one as it emanates forth. And so the problem of evil, as we encounter it within a Christian context, does not arise in that particular context. And so he is making the case that that there are forms of theism in which the problem of evil is not a problem, and consequently it's not his obligation on a night when he is just defending the existence of God, not any particular notion of God. It is not necessary for him to explore that question. The problem with that, I think, the big problem with that is that the people listening to that want to know how to think about it. They don't want to know that I could believe in God and not have to address the problem of evil. I think they want to know, how do I, with my understanding of God, address the problem of evil? And to simply say, well, I could accept another definition of God and not have to deal with the problem is probably not very satisfactory to the people in that crowd. Perhaps that's formally true in the sense that in this particular debate, if you want to narrow it down to a very, very small realm of defense of something that you're trying to defend, perhaps formally it's true. But so far as the debate itself is concerned, I think that it is probably very unwise to leave the question unanswered or at least untouched in any way. So that's another disappointing thing. And I think, in my mind, it was disappointing that he was too willing to concede to a deistic understanding of God. It was disappointing that he was so quick to throw off a Christian conception of God to simply substitute another and say, therefore, because I can give you another definition of God, I don't have to worry about these other definitions. Finally, he didn't in any place, as far as I can tell, the Christian didn't in any place address the supposed contradiction between God's omniscience and omnipotence. One of the things that Dan Barker argued was that the very notion of God is incoherent because the attributes of God contradict each other. So, for example, if God knows everything, then God knows what I'm going to do tomorrow, and therefore human freedom is impossible, and God is incapable of changing tomorrow. If God knows that tomorrow I'm going to do something, and he knows it infallibly, then how can God have all power? He can't change tomorrow. He's subject to whatever's going to happen tomorrow. And so in that sense, God's omniscience, that God knows everything, and God's omnipotence are at odds with each other. And he raises this question, and so far as I can tell, Reynolds never responded to that particular claim. And it's so common, that particular claim is so common, that I think that it deserved a response from the Christian. Now, let me just make a few comments about those several things real quick before running out of time in this presentation, and then I'll try another presentation in which I'll say some things about Mr. Barker. But with respect to those three issues, where did God come from? The question, where did God come from? And I've dealt with this in some other presentations here and there. But on the question, where did God come from, I think the question is a misunderstanding of the traditional arguments that are given for the existence of God. First of all, the reason why we ask where a watch came from is because it's made up of all these multiple parts that do not account for their own assembling. That the coming together of those various things is a process. It's something that has come to be. There's no reason to think, for example, that the watch that's laying there on the ground, to use Paley's example, which Barker brought up during the evening, to use William Paley's famous example of a watch being found on the ground and prompting the mind to consider where did it come from, or how did these various parts come together for this purposeful activity. The problem here is that what we're looking at is an object made up of things that are part of a world of becoming, and therefore it's meaningful to ask of something that has come to be, or that is part of a process of changing material things. It's reasonable to ask, how did that come to be the case, that those things are together? However, if I have reason to believe that there is an unchanging eternal reality, if I can give you a good reason to think that there is an unchanging eternal reality, to ask where that reality came from doesn't make any sense, because it's not part of the realm of becoming or change. If something has always been the case, it doesn't matter to ask, or it doesn't make sense to ask, where did it come from, or how did the thing that never comes to be come to be? That doesn't make sense. So I think that Barker's claim that asking where did God come from is a meaningful question is in fact not a meaningful question if we understand what we mean by God. And elsewhere in various presentations here, I've tried to present reasons for believing that there is a first reality. If there is a first reality, then it doesn't make sense to ask where did the first reality come from, because then it wouldn't be the first reality anymore. The reason why we ask about things in this world, as I've already pointed out, is because we see that they are part of a world of changing and becoming. As a part of the world of change and becoming, then they need an explanation, because they are by their very nature things that have come to be. The second problem, the problem of evil, is one that I think that especially needed to be addressed because of the way it was presented in the course of the evening. This is a very complicated and difficult problem. Why do people suffer? Why is there evil in a world made by a good God? And the situations that were brought up, for example, going over to a hospital and seeing people die of cancer, these are very emotional and moving problems. Or just in the last few days, a typhoon in the Philippines that apparently killed 10,000 people or more. How do we account for such things as this? And why doesn't God step in and do something about them? I would say that, just as a beginning of a response to this, I would say, first of all, that when we think about evil events in our own lives, for example, if I think about bad things that have happened in my life, or evil things, perhaps a experience of suffering or pain or whatever, when we think of such evils that happen in our lives, it's impossible to truly come to terms with that experience without seeing it as part of a larger narrative or a larger context. If we try to isolate an experience of suffering or evil and then try to make sense of it isolated from every other consideration, then I think we're doomed to not be able to explain it. Imagine the worst experience of your life and just focus on that experience. Just isolate it all on its own and then try to make sense of it. I don't think it is possible to make sense of an experience of suffering. Like, for example, a typhoon. It's not possible for me to make sense of why this person died in a typhoon when all I know of them is their experience of dying in a typhoon. However, what if a person, whatever age they are, let's say an infant that died in this typhoon in the last few days, what if that infant, when they all of a sudden experience a rush of water or perhaps a house caving in on them, and they experience this moment of physical suffering, what if it's followed by the most glorious and the most exhilarating experience that is possible for us as human beings? What if it's followed by an experience of enraptured joy and happiness and fulfillment after that experience of suffering? And what if that experience of suffering enhances and helps to define the nature of that experience of enraptured joy and fulfillment that they experience subsequent to it? If we could put that experience of suffering into a larger context of happiness, of unending happiness, and that it enhances it in some way because of the contrast between the evil experience and the joys that follow it, perhaps there is some measure of understanding that could be gained through it. Again, I'm not trying to solve all problems here. I'm just saying that in isolating an event or an experience from a broader narrative or context is a very dangerous thing to do. What I would encourage you to do is to look at your own life and your own experiences. Many of us, our lives have for the most part, been free of such painful experiences in many ways, and then we have certain moments in our lives where we have great suffering. Other people perhaps experience what seems to be continuous pain and suffering in other ways. And sometimes those people that have very little pain or suffering in their lives often complain all the time about any little difficulty they have. Whereas on the other hand, sometimes people who suffer a great deal find themselves enriched by their experience, their joys and their experiences of happiness, even though there seems to be this constant presence of suffering with them. What I'm suggesting to you is that the meaning of human suffering can only be discovered from within the experience itself and what it does to us and what the ultimate outcome of it is. We can't abstract away from the human experience and the way in which we encounter it and respond to it and what it does to us. So it's a massive subject, but I must stop.